Hello, and thank you for tuning in to this e-learning webinar, Stand and Deliver, Managing an International Supply Chain, created as part of International Charity Fraud Awareness Week. The week brings together everyone involved in the charity and not-for-profit sectors to raise awareness and share good practice in tackling fraud and corruption. We encourage you to share this video and any of our other resources with your colleagues. According to some sources, UK charities spend upwards of £20 billion a year with suppliers, equating to an average of some 48% of their income. Whether buying goods, products or services, most charities will have supply chains they need to manage to ensure they can deliver their objectives and serve their clients and beneficiaries. Where there are supply chains, there will be the risk of supply chain fraud, whether involving suppliers acting alone, staff acting alone, or both acting together. Over the next few minutes, we will examine the challenges of managing an international supply chain, some of the main types of fraud to look out for in this area, and some suggestions for mitigating the risks charities can face. In a world increasingly enabled by technology, supply chains are becoming more global and complex in nature, which brings additional challenges in terms of managing fraud risks. How easy is it to conduct due diligence over suppliers who are based overseas, for example? Or how easy is it to enforce contract clauses and claw back funds paid out for services that were not delivered when your supplier is based in another jurisdiction? Not to mention the different regulatory and legal frameworks in place in different countries. In this context, charities working overseas can face challenges in managing their supply chains. Public records and company documentation may be unavailable or easily forged, requiring an alternative approach to due diligence in certain countries. Payment systems may be reliant on cash or checks to settle supplier invoices, meaning less security over funds transfers and potentially less control over where the money is ultimately going. Geographical remoteness may make it more difficult to monitor supplier performance and to ensure the timely and complete delivery of goods or services. There may be language barriers between suppliers and those purchasing goods or services, which can further exacerbate the situation. All of these factors increase the vulnerability of these supply chains to fraud. Supply chains are vulnerable to fraud perpetrated entirely from outside the organization, entirely from within, or by the two parties colluding with one another. Indicators of fraud, or red flags, are just that, indicators that something may not be as it should be. There may be other explanations that are not fraudulent for these indicators, such as errors or a lack of training. From an entirely external perspective, charities can be vulnerable to mandate fraud, where someone pretends to be an organization that the charity regularly makes payments to and requests a change of bank account details to change them to their own. Charities should have a verification process in place to manage any such requests to ensure that they are genuine before following through on them. Supply chain frauds can also be carried out by suppliers billing for goods or services that have not been provided. So adding on charges for additional goods to an invoice, for example, or billing for services that were not provided at all. Fraud could also be committed where lower quality goods or services are substituted for those paid for, allowing the supplier to benefit financially and the charity to lose out. This would include situations where more experienced consultants are paid for than actually work on a project, for example. These types of fraud can be perpetrated by suppliers acting alone, or by suppliers and staff acting together and splitting the financial or other benefit. You might notice this type of fraud as a result of increases in invoice values, or a result of defective goods, or maybe lots of complaints about services, indicating that the supplier is not delivering as promised. Supply chains are also vulnerable to fraud in the selection process, where certain suppliers may be selected in exchange for a bribe to a staff member instead of for being the best person for the job. This can be referred to as a kickback. The bribe involved here is not limited to only a financial benefit, but could be in the form of lavish gifts and hospitality provided by a supplier to a staff member. Staff members acting alone may commit fraud in the supply chain by setting up entirely fictitious companies and making payments to these allegedly in exchange for goods or services that they have delivered. You can spot this by monitoring new suppliers set up and doing so on a regular basis. Contract splitting may also be used to conceal fraudulent payments to suppliers. By splitting contracts into smaller amounts, they will often fall below thresholds for additional scrutiny as part of a procurement process, allowing payments to be made without the need for a full tendering process, for example, or for any additional scrutiny. Charities can protect themselves from supply chain fraud by carrying out appropriate due diligence on their supply chains and also ensuring that they conduct reference checks on staff. It's easier to avoid working with a supplier or individual than to take action after something goes wrong. Effective contract monitoring is key to ensuring that your charity receives the goods it has paid for and the quality of service delivery that it has requested. Knowing what each supplier should be doing and when, having the ability to spot check their work, and having an identified individual responsible for the management of a given contract within your charity will all support this process. Strong segregation of duties in the payments process can help protect your charity from supply chain fraud by reducing the opportunity for unauthorized payments to be made to suppliers and the possibility that payments are made to entirely fictitious organizations. Ensuring that payments are made in line with contracts, purchase orders and invoices will also reduce the risks of funds going astray. Robust supplier setup processes also help protect your charity. By building in due diligence checks at this stage, charities can prevent suppliers from entering their system instead of trying to remove them later on. Robust setup processes can include checks against Companies House, tax registration checks, and reference checks from previous clients on work that has been carried out. Carrying out some form of spend analysis on a regular basis will allow your charity to identify any anomalies in spend patterns or suppliers being paid that are unexpected. This can be as straightforward as looking through a list of the top 10 suppliers your charity spends with on a monthly basis, or maybe analysing the contracts just below the approval thresholds to identify any potential contract splitting. You will know best what looks normal in your charity after all. Just to wrap up then with 5 top tips. Make sure that you set expectations for your suppliers. One way of doing this can be to use a supplier code of conduct, setting out the behaviours you expect to see from your suppliers. Due diligence. Carry out appropriate due diligence adapted to the context you're working in. If there's no Companies House to go to in the countries you work in, what are the alternatives that you could use instead? I can't overstate the importance of contracts. Ensure that everything is appropriately documented at the start will prevent problems later on. You can carry out simple spend analysis that is appropriate to the size of your charity to identify any anomalies. Finally, if something looks too good to be true, it probably is. And this is equally true with supplier reports as with everything else. If they look too perfect, then it's worth asking questions. Thank you for listening. Please remember to check out the other free resources created as part of the week, which are available on our online hub. Together we can keep charity fraud out.